These are the lecture notes for Chapter 3 on the Kingdom Plantae. We are going to cover features of land plants, and then we will cover the phylum Bryophyta or Bryophyte, Lycophyta, Pteridophyta, and then the seed plants would be phylum Gymnosperm and phylum Angiosperm. So it would be a total of 5 plant phyla that we're going to cover. All right, so the characteristics that are common to all plants, all members of the Kingdom Plantae, are that they are multicellular, photosynthetic, and they have eukaryotic cells. All their cells have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. And so that means, of course, that they are members of the domain Eukarya. As far as the evolutionary history, the evidence shows that current plants evolved from a freshwater green alga. And the reason so we know that algae are found within the Kingdom Protista, and the reason that they are not included with plants in the Kingdom Plantae is that besides protecting the zygote, plants also protect and nourish the embryo, especially seed plants. But even plants that don't produce seeds produce spores. And so but the seed plants definitely, the seed is designed to protect the embryo and nourish the embryo. So let's look at this chart, which shows some of the classification groups of plants and some of the characteristics of the different phyla. So we have domain Eukarya, supergroup Archaeoplastida. Remember that the algae, the green and red algae, also are members of this supergroup. But here we're just going to cover the organisms within the Kingdom Plantae. Now, the phylum Bryophyte or Bryophyta includes the non-vascular plants, and we have 3 main primary examples, and that would be the mosses first. We're going to cover the mosses in a lot more detail, but you do need to at least know that liverworts and hornworts are members of the bryophytes. Then we will move on to the seedless vascular plants. So these plants have vascular tissue, which is kind of like blood vessels in animals, and veins, veins and arteries in animals. It's vascular tissue for transporting nutrients and waste throughout the plant. But they are seedless. So these members of these phyla do produce spores rather than seeds. So the lycophytes, which are the club mosses, not true mosses, but club mosses, and then the pteridophytes, which include the ferns. Then we have the vascular plants that we call seed plants, and they're going to be the gymnosperms, which means naked seed, and most of them have cones. And the angiosperms, which means covered seed. And that's going to be the flowering plants. So these are going to have flowers and fruits. All right, so as far as a little bit about the history of land plants, the ancestors were most closely related to the charophytes, chara, and coleochaetes. And here is a photograph of a chara, and then an image of the tissue for a coleochaete. And these are both members of the green algae. Okay, adaptation to land. The adaptations that enable plants to live on land rather than water help to minimize dehydration or desiccation. They help the plant, the body of the plant is heavy, so they help it to deal with the effects of gravity. The tissues have to be tougher, basically, and damage from sunlight or ultraviolet radiation. So one of the modifications is a waxy covering called a cuticle. You may have noticed on some leaves, like especially a leaf of, think about a cactus or, let's see, all leaves have a waxy coating on the surface, but I'm just trying to think of the cactus and like an aloe vera plant. Their cuticle is very thick. So anyway, but the cuticle is like the top part of the leaf that's kind of waxy and shiny compared to the underside of it. So the cuticle protects against desiccation or drying out. Then we have openings in the leaf called stomata. And stomata are openings mostly found on the underside of the leaf because the cuticle is going to block the stomata on the top side of the leaf. But the underside of the leaf isn't going to have a really thick waxy coating, so you're going to find more of these openings. Stomata allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to enter and leave the leaf, and also allow for water vapor to leave the leaf by a process we call transpiration. So basically gases enter and exit the leaf through the stomata. And then down at the bottom, to move water against the force, that should be gravity, against the force of gravity, many plants have tracheids, specialized cells with proteins that resist gravity and facilitate the upward transport of water and minerals from the roots to the top of the plant. So tracheids are specialized cells for transporting water and minerals. Okay, this shows you a closer view of the cuticle of a leaf on the top surface. It's waterproof, so it helps prevent drying out. And then the underside of the leaf, this is an illustration of what the underside of a leaf would look like under a microscope. The stomata are these slit-like openings. They are able to open and close. They're regulated so that they don't stay open all the time, but they open when they need to. And they allow for gas exchange. We also have, to reduce the effects of ultraviolet radiation, plants have both a haploid and diploid generation. So land plants have a life cycle called alternation of generations life cycle, and this is specific to plants. They have a portion of the plant structure that all the cells are haploid, and then a portion that all the cells are diploid. And so for every one of the plant phyla that we learn, we will talk about which plant structure is haploid, which is diploid, and for that particular group of plants, and also which is dominant, the haploid structure or the diploid structure. And we'll talk about what dominant means, but it's going to be important that you know, is the gametophyte dominant or is the sporophyte dominant? So this is just some general information about the life cycle alternation of generations. All plants, no matter what type of plant, all plants exhibit this life cycle. They alternate between a multicellular haploid phase. That means the structure that is haploid is multicellular. All the cells are haploid. They only contain one set of chromosomes. And then a multicellular diploid phase. The haploid phase is called the gametophyte structure, and the diploid phase is called the sporophyte structure. We do have sexual reproduction in plants, so the male gametangia are called antheridia. When we get to flowering plants, the male structure is called the anther. That's the structure that produces pollen in flowering plants. And the female structure would be called the it's called the ova, the egg. But well, okay, so the ovule and the ovum, the ovary and the ovule. So it's more at the flowering plants terminology is more closely related to animal terminology. But on a plant, the female gametangia is called the archegonia. So this is the structure that produces the female gametophytes, the eggs, and the antheridia produce the sperm. Okay, so the gametophyte structure is haploid, the sporophyte structure is diploid, and the sporophyte structure carries out meiosis to produce spores, and the spores are haploid, and if they germinate, they form into haploid gametophytes. So this is an image of the life cycle. The top half of the life cycle represents the diploid stage of the plant, and the bottom half that's colored brown represents the haploid stage. So basically, if we have, after fertilization, we have the zygote, which is diploid, and that's the original cell that's going to form. It's going to grow by mitosis and form into the sporophyte structure of the plant. And the sporophyte, all the cells are diploid. The sporophyte is going to undergo meiosis and produce spores. And those spores in the mosses and the ferns, in the first 3 phyla that we study, the spores are going to just be spores. They're not going to develop into seeds. But the spore is haploid, and that spore will germinate, and it will divide by mitosis into the haploid gametophyte structure. And the gametophytes will form into haploid gametes, the sperm and the egg. Okay, so the dominant generation we also call the conspicuous generation, This is like if you are looking at the plant, the structure that you recognize as this is what the plant looks like, that is the dominant or conspicuous generation. For example, when I look at moss, let's find a good picture of moss. When I look at moss plants growing on the ground, growing on some surface, I'm trying to find like a real picture. Image, photograph. I guess we don't have one. Okay, well, we know what moss looks like, right? It looks like this green, the plants are very short, almost looks like a carpet, a green carpet. So that moss plant that you recognize as the moss plant, this part right here, is the gametophyte. And in mosses, the gametophyte is the dominant generation. But then if I think about a fern, a lot of people have ferns in hanging baskets, and they look, the fern fronds look like this. Okay, so when I think about a fern plant, this portion, this structure that I recognize as the fern plant is actually the sporophyte generation. So the conspicuous or dominant generation in the fern is the sporophyte. Dominant generation in the moss is gametophyte. Dominant generation in the fern is the sporophyte. The dominant generation in the gymnosperm and the angiosperm is the actual trees, the actual plants themselves, because the gametophyte generation is reduced. You don't always even see those. They're just small structures that grow on the sporophyte. But the dominant generation is going to be important to know. So the dominant generation in mosses or bryophytes is gametophyte. In all the other plants, the sporophyte is dominant. That's very important for you to remember. The gametophyte is the dominant structure in the moss plant and all of the bryophytes. And then all the other groups of plants that we study, the sporophyte is dominant. Okay, so that's not that hard to remember. These are illustrations of the gametophyte structure and the sporophyte structure. You can see in the moss that the gametophyte is the dominant structure. The sporophyte is just this stalk with a capsule on the end that releases spores. And this only grows from the female gametophyte. There's also a male gametophyte that will not have the sporophyte generation that grows from it because it grows from the egg. Okay, then in the fern, the sporophyte is dominant, and that is the fern plant that you recognize. And then the gametophyte is a heart-shaped leaf that kind of grows flat against the forest floor or against the soil. And it's very hard to find unless you know what you're looking for. But the gametophyte is a heart-shaped, flat leaf. In the gymnosperm, the sporophyte is the tree itself. Same thing with the angiosperm, and the gametophyte are the male and female structures that house the sperm and egg.